In the killing winter of 1887, a black stallion no man could break stood between Ethan Mercer and the ruin of everything his father bled for, and the town of Red Hollow decided that if the horse threw him one more time, he'd have to marry the woman they pitied most. They called Clara Whitmore the spinster schoolteacher. They didn't know she understood that horse better than any cowboy alive. Stay with me until the very end of this story, and drop a like and a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels tonight. The wind came down off the big horns the way it always did in late January, mean and dry, carrying the smell of frozen sage and wood smoke from the chimneys of Red Hollow. Snow lay in dirty crusts along the boardwalks. The cattle in the holding pens behind Doolin's feed stores stood with their heads low and their breath steaming, packed tight against the cold. And somewhere out past the livery, a dog was barking at nothing. It was just past 9 in the morning when Ethan Mercer rode in from the Bar M with the black stallion roped behind his bay gelding. He came down the main street slow because the stallion would not be led any other way. The horse was 16 hands of coal dark muscle, ribs showing a little under the winter coat, eyes rolling white at every dog that ran out to bark and every door that banged in the wind. The rope around its neck was double wrapped to Ethan's saddle horn, and every few yards the stallion would set its feet and yank back hard enough to nearly pull the bay sideways. Ethan didn't speak to the animal. He didn't speak to anyone. He just kept his shoulders square under his heavy canvas coat and his hat pulled low against the glare off the snow, and he rode. People came out of the buildings to watch. They always did. There wasn't much else to look at in Red Hollow in January. Mrs. Doolin appeared in the doorway of the feed store with her apron bunched in her fists. Old Hap Pruitt limped out of the saloon with a tin cup of coffee still in his hand. 2 of the Henson boys, no older than 15, came tearing out of the smithy in shirt sleeves to see, and their mother shouted them back inside, and they didn't go. "That the one?" Hap called out, his voice cracked on the cold. Ethan touched the brim of his hat without looking. "That's the one." "He's going to kill somebody, Ethan." "He's not. He killed Whitey's bay. That horse threw a clot. Wasn't this one's fault." Hap spat brown into the snow. "You tell yourself what you need to." Ethan rode on. He could feel the looks on him the way you feel a hand laid on the back of your neck. 29 years old, the youngest son of a dead man, and he was hauling a horse into town that nobody believed could be broken because he had a meeting at noon with a man from Cheyenne who would not write the check unless he believed Ethan Mercer was the kind of man who finished what he started. The trouble was that the meeting at noon was the last of 3 meetings, and the first 2 had not gone well. The cattle broker's name was Augustus Holloway. He was 46 years old, came out of Chicago by way of Cheyenne, wore a beaver felt hat indoors and a watch chain that crossed his vest like a second smile. He had money behind him from a syndicate Ethan didn't entirely understand, and he had cattle he wanted to winter on the south pasture of the Bar M, and he had an offer that would put $800 in Ethan's hand by the end of the month and roll into a partnership by spring if it went well. $800 would pay off the note Ethan's father had left on the ranch. It would put hay in the loft for a second winter. It would let Ethan keep the 4 hired hands that were currently working for the promise of wages and 3 meals a day and a cook shack that hadn't seen butter since November. Without it, Ethan was finished. He had known that since November, too. Holloway had come up to the ranch the first time in early December, and Ethan had taken him out across the south pasture in a buckboard and watched the man's eyes move over the snow-stubbled grass and the lines of the fences and the way the river bent at the cottonwoods. And Holloway had said, "Yes, this'll do. This'll do nicely." And then he had seen the black stallion in the corral by the barn. The stallion had been Ethan's father's last good idea and his first dead one. Cyrus Mercer had bought the horse at a sale in Casper the summer before he died, paid more than he had, and brought him home with a notion of breeding him to the half-Morgan mares the Bar M ran. The horse had not been broken when Cyrus bought him. The horse had not been broken when Cyrus died 6 months later from a kick that broke his ribs and a fever that broke his lungs. The horse had stayed in the corral by the barn ever since. Nobody had ridden him. 2 cowhands had tried. Both walked away from it, one with a wrenched shoulder, one with a cracked collarbone and a long quiet streak afterward that he never explained. Holloway had stood at the fence and watched the stallion pace, and his face had done something Ethan didn't like. "That a saddle horse?" he'd asked. "He will be." "He's not now." "He will be." Holloway had smiled a little. It was not a friendly smile. "Mercer, I'm putting 2,000 head of cattle on your land come spring. That's a lot of money for a man who can't break a horse that's been standing in his own corral for 2 years. He'll be broken. By whom? By me. Holloway had looked at him then, longer than was comfortable, the way a man looks at a price tag he isn't sure he wants to pay. Then he had nodded once and said he would be back at the end of January to see how things stood, and they had not spoken of the horse again. That had been 7 weeks ago. The end of January was tomorrow. All set. The plan, as Ethan had explained it to his foreman Silas Boone over coffee at 4 that morning, had been to bring the stallion into town because the corral at the Bar M was too small to work him in and the snow was too deep in the bottoms to ride out. The plan had been to use the big corral behind the livery, where there was good footing and a high fence, and to spend the day working the horse where Holloway and his 2 associates could see it when they came in on the noon stage from Cheyenne. The plan had been to look like a man who had things in hand. Silas, who was 56 and had been with the Bar M since Ethan was a boy, had set down his coffee cup very carefully and said, "Son, don't. That horse is going to throw you in front of the whole town." "He's not." "He is." "And then what?" "Then I get back on." Silas had looked at him for a long time across the cook shack table. The lamp between them had been guttering low on cheap oil. Outside, the wind had been working the loose tin on the bunkhouse roof. "Your daddy," Silas had said finally, "used to tell me that horses know when you're scared and when you're proud. He said proud was worse." "My daddy got himself killed by that horse." "Your daddy got himself killed by a kick from a horse he should have had more sense than to walk behind. There's a difference." Ethan had not answered that. He had finished his coffee and gone out into the dark to saddle the bay. By 10:30, the corral behind the livery was lined 3 deep with people. Word had gotten around the way it always did, faster than a man on a horse. And now there were children up on the fence rails, and women standing back by the wagons, and old men with their hands buried in their coat pockets and their breath fogging out in slow plumes. The blacksmith had come over from his forge with his sleeves still rolled up. The barber had locked his door. Mrs. Doolin had brought a kettle of coffee and was selling cups for a penny. It had the air of a hanging or a wedding. The 2 events had always been close in Red Hollow. Ethan stood inside the corral with the stallion at the far end. He had pulled his coat off, despite the cold, and he was wearing only his shirt and his vest and his chaps and his hat. He had a coiled rope in his left hand and a hackamore in his right. The stallion was watching him sidelong, head high, ears flicking back and forth, body angled the way a horse angles when it is thinking about which way to bolt. The horse had not yet been touched. That was the thing nobody outside the Bar M understood. In 2 years, no one had laid a steady hand on him. They had roped him to move him, they had thrown feed in over the rail, they had cleaned the corral around him with him in it, but no one had ever stood beside him quiet and put a hand on his shoulder. He had come to the Bar M wild, and he had stayed wild because nobody had time for the work it would take to make him otherwise. Ethan didn't have time now either. That was the problem. He moved toward the stallion, the way Silas had taught him to move toward green horses when he was a boy. Slow, sideways, eyes down. He talked low, nonsense words, the way you talk to a child who has woken up frightened in the dark. The stallion let him come within 10 feet, then 8, then 6. Then the wind shifted, and somewhere behind Ethan a child laughed, and the stallion went up. He came down running. Ethan got the rope on him on the second cast, dallied to the snubbing post in the center of the corral, and the horse hit the end of it hard enough to rock the post in the frozen ground. The crowd made a noise. Not quite a cheer, not quite a gasp. A man's voice from the rails called out, "Ride him, Mercer!" And another voice, drunker, called, "2 bits says he don't last a minute." "5 says he don't last 30 seconds, somebody answered. "Quiet," Ethan said, not loud. He didn't look at the crowd. He kept his eyes on the horse. It took 20 minutes to get the hackamore on. The stallion fought every inch of it, but he was tied now, and he had only so much rope, and Ethan was patient when he had to be. By the time the leather settled behind the horse's ears, the stallion was lathered white at the shoulders despite the cold, and Ethan's hands were shaking inside his gloves from the strain. He led the stallion to the snubbing post. He cinched a blanket over its back. The horse stood for that, just barely, ears pinned flat. He cinched a saddle over the blanket. The horse trembled but did not move. He drew the cinch tight, then tighter, the way you have to with a horse that hasn't been saddled, because they hold their breath and bloat their bellies, and an hour later your rig rolls under them, and you are dead." Then he stepped back. He looked at the saddle on the stallion's back. He looked at the stallion's eye. The eye was wrong. He had known horses all his life, and he knew the difference between an angry eye and a frightened one, and the stallion's eye was the second thing. But there was no time to think about that. The noon stage from Cheyenne was already late and could come down the road any minute, and the crowd was watching, and Silas was somewhere at the back of the crowd with his arms folded across his chest and a look on his face that Ethan could feel without seeing. He gathered the reins. He set his boot in the stirrup. He swung up. For one breath, nothing happened. Then the stallion came apart underneath him like a thing exploding. But what Ethan remembered afterward was not the bucking exactly. He had been on rough horses before. He knew the feel of a horse going up and coming down, the way the ground sees you and then doesn't. What he remembered was the noise of it, the grunt the horse made each time its hooves hit, the creak of the saddle, the thin, sharp sound of his own breath driven out of him, and underneath all of it the strange high silence of the crowd, like they were all holding their breath together to see what would happen. He stayed on for the first three. He stayed on for the fourth. On the fifth, the stallion came up almost straight, and on the way down twisted, and Ethan felt his right foot come out of the stirrup and knew, with the cold, clear certainty of a man falling off a roof, that he was finished. He went over the stallion's left shoulder. He hit the frozen ground on his back and his head snapped down, and the world went white at the edges. He did not lose consciousness. He wished, very briefly, that he had. He heard, through the ringing in his ears, the crowd making its sound. Not the noise of a town watching its own man triumph, but the noise of a town watching its own man fail. There was laughter in it, not all of it, but some. He rolled to his knees. He felt blood in his mouth where he had bitten his tongue. He pushed himself up. The stallion was at the far end of the corral now, sides heaving, the saddle still on, the reins trailing, and the horse was looking at him with that same wrong eye. Ethan spat blood into the snow. He picked up his hat. He walked toward the horse. "Mercer!" Hap Pruitt called from the rails. "Boy, that's enough." "It's not." "You're bleeding." "I'm fine." "Ethan." That was Silas's voice, low, close. The old foreman had climbed over the fence and was crossing the corral, hands open, palms out. "Ethan, son." "Not today." "He's going to be ridden today. He's going to kill you today." Ethan turned on him. He didn't mean to. His face must have looked like something because Silas stopped where he was and didn't come any closer. "Holloway's coming," Ethan said. His voice was rough. "Holloway's coming, and if that horse ain't standing quiet by noon, I am done. We are done. You hear me? We are done." Silas looked at him. He looked at the horse. He looked at the crowd. He didn't say anything. Ethan turned back and walked toward the stallion. He got within 5 feet. The horse was shaking, not bucking, not threatening, shaking, the way a dog shakes when it has been beaten and is waiting for it again. Ethan saw it. He had seen it the first time too, before he got on. He saw it, and he did not know what to do with it, because he didn't have time for what to do with it. He needed the horse ridden. He needed the horse ridden in the next hour. He needed Holloway's money in his hand by Friday. He gathered the reins. He started to lift his foot toward the stirrup. The stallion screamed. It was the worst sound Ethan had ever heard a horse make, high and thin and almost human. And the horse came up before he was anywhere near the saddle, came up rearing, and one front hoof clipped the side of his jaw on the way down, and Ethan went sideways into the snubbing post and slid down it with the whole left side of his face going hot and numb at the same time. This time, the crowd did not make a sound. He lay against the post for a long moment. He tasted blood and tasted iron and tasted, somewhere far back, the burn of bile. He looked up at the sky. The sky was very blue and very far away. Then he heard the noon stage coming down the main street, the four-horse rattle of it, the squeak of the brake going on, the driver hollering. He closed his eyes. Just for a second. Just for a breath. When he opened them, Augustus Holloway was standing at the rail of the corral in his beaver felt hat, looking at him with an expression that was not surprise and not pity. It was disappointment, which was worse than either. They got Ethan up. Silas and a man named Pete Hardesty, who worked at the livery between them, lifted him under the arms and walked him out of the corral. He could walk, mostly. The left side of his face was already swelling. He could feel one of his teeth loose in the back. His shirt was dark down the front from where blood had run out of his mouth. Holloway watched him come. "Mr. Mercer," Holloway said. "Mr. Holloway, you look unwell." I've had better mornings. Holloway took out a small silver case, opened it, removed a thin, dark cigar. He did not offer one. He clipped the end with a tool from his vest pocket and lit it carefully with a lucifer match, sheltering the flame from the wind with the curve of his palm. The two men behind him, younger men, hired men, men whose business Ethan did not know, stood with their hands in their coat pockets and did not look at him. I came, Holloway said around the cigar, to see a man who could control his property. I see a man who cannot stay on his own horse. He'll be broken. By when? By spring. By spring, Holloway repeated. He looked at the stallion, still at the far end of the corral, still trembling. Mr. Mercer, I have wintered a great many cattle on a great many ranches. The ranches that prosper are run by men whose animals do as they're told. The ranches that fail are run by men whose animals do not. I am not in a position to invest 2,000 head of beef in a ranch that cannot break one horse. It's one horse. Yes, and you cannot break it. The silence after that was very thick. Ethan was aware of the crowd still there, still pressed against the rails, listening. He was aware of Silas standing a little behind him, not speaking. He was aware of the blood drying on his chin. Give me a week, he said. Holloway considered. He drew on the cigar. He let the smoke out slow. I'll do better than that, he said. I'll give you to the end of the week, Friday afternoon. I will be back here Friday afternoon on the 4 o'clock stage, and you will ride that horse around this corral 3 times, at a walk and a trot, with my associates watching from this rail. If you can do that, the arrangement stands. If you cannot, I take my cattle to Vernon Pratt at the Lazy K, and you and I are no longer in business. Friday. Friday, Ethan nodded. It hurt to nod. He started to say something else, some word of thanks, some reassurance, but Holloway had already half turned away and was speaking to one of his hired men in a low voice, and the moment had closed. It was then that Hap Pruitt opened his mouth. Hap was old. Hap was drunk by 10 in the morning most days and drunker by noon. Hap had a meanness in him that the years had not softened, but only polished into something more efficient. Hap leaned on the corral rail with his tin cup empty in his hand, and he called out, loud enough for the whole gathered crowd to hear. And if he can't ride him, Mr. Holloway, you reckon we ought to find him a wife to settle him down? Schoolmarm Whitmore's still available, I hear. Been available a while. The laughter that broke out was not the whole crowd, but it was enough of the crowd. It rolled along the fence rails like a wave, and one of the Henson boys laughed loudest because he was 15 and didn't know any better, and somebody behind him, a woman's voice, which made it worse, said, Lord, that's the truth. Somebody ought to. Holloway turned back. He looked at Hap. He looked, with new interest, at Ethan. Who, he said, is Schoolmarm Whitmore? Clara Whitmore was 38 years old. She had come to Red Hollow 11 years before, from a town in Ohio that nobody here had heard of, to take the school teacher's position after the previous school teacher had run off with a cattle drover. She lived in 2 rented rooms above the dry goods store. She wore gray and brown, and once, on Christmas, a dark green. She had brown hair that she kept pinned back and brown eyes that were larger than people expected when they looked closely, which they mostly didn't. She was not pretty in the way Red Hollow understood prettiness. She was not ugly either. She was, the town had decided long ago, plain. And plain was the worst thing a woman could be in a place where being looked at was the only currency a woman had that nobody could take from her without her noticing. She had been engaged once, when she was 22, to a man in Ohio who had died of typhoid 2 months before the wedding. She had told one person in Red Hollow this, and that person had told everyone. And so the whole town knew it and used it against her the way small towns use everything against everyone. Not cruelly, exactly, but constantly, the way a creek wears down a stone. Poor Clara, they said, almost married once. Never quite. She taught the children of Red Hollow their letters and their mums. She taught them the names of the rivers and the capitals of the states. She taught them, as best she could, that the world was bigger than this valley. Most of them forgot what she taught them within a year of leaving her classroom. A few did not, and those few were the reason she stayed. That was Clara Whitmore. That was who Hap Pruitt had named at the rail of the corral that morning. And Clara Whitmore was, at that moment, walking up the main street of Red Hollow with a sack of flour and a tin of tea in her arms, having just come out of Doolin's. She heard the laughter before she saw the crowd. She had heard laughter like that before. She knew, with a sense that women like her develop the way deer develop the sense for wolves, that it had something to do with her. She slowed. She did not stop. She kept walking, because stopping would be worse, and she came around the corner of the livery and saw them all there. Half the town on the corral rails. Ethan Mercer standing bleeding by the snubbing post. The man in the beaver hat with the cigar. Hap Pruitt grinning, and the laughter still rolling and dying in small pockets along the fence. Holloway was looking down the street. He saw her come around the corner. He did not know her, but he saw the way the laughter changed when she appeared, quieter, more uncomfortable, with a guilty edge. And he understood, the way men of his sort understand, exactly what had happened and exactly who she was. He smiled very slightly around his cigar. "Mr. Mercer," he said. Ethan did not look at Clara. He could not. He was looking at the ground in front of his boots. "Mr. Mercer, look at me." Ethan looked up. "It is no business of mine," Holloway said, "what arrangements you make in your private life. But I will tell you, as one businessman to another, that a man who is laughed at in his own town is a man whose word means very little outside of it. If these people, your neighbors, your customers, the men whose cattle will graze beside mine, if these people do not respect you, then your handshake is not worth the calluses on your hand. Do you understand me?" "Yes." "Then I will say this once, and only once, and you will do with it what you will. Ride the horse by Friday. Settle whatever else needs settling. If by Friday afternoon I see a man standing in this corral who has the respect of the people standing around it, we have a deal. If I do not, I have other ranches to consider." He paused. He flicked ash from his cigar. "The mathematics of it are very simple, Mr. Mercer. I am not asking you to be a great man. I am asking you to be a man who is not laughed at. Good day." He touched his hat. He turned. He walked back toward the main street with his two associates trailing behind him, and the crowd parted for him, and Clara Whitmore, still holding her flower and her tin of tea, stepped back out of his way and into the shadow of the livery wall. He passed her without looking at her. Ethan finally raised his eyes. Clara was looking at him. She had a face. He saw this for what felt like the first time, though he had seen her 100 times in 11 years. She had a face that was not plain at all when she was angry. Her mouth was tight. Her chin was up. Her brown eyes had a heat in them that he had never noticed, and that nobody in this town had ever bothered to notice. And she was looking at him the way a person looks at someone who has stood by while she was hit. Because he had. He had stood by. Hap Pruitt had thrown her name into the corral like a stone, and the town had laughed, and Ethan had said nothing. He had not even looked at her. He opened his mouth. He didn't know what he was going to say. She turned. She walked away. She did not run, which was the part that would stay with him afterward. She did not give them the satisfaction of running. She walked with her back straight and the flour sack in her arms and her chin up down the main street of Red Hollow toward the dry goods store, and she did not look back. The crowd began to break up. People drifted off in twos and threes, suddenly remembering errands. Mrs. Doolin gathered up her kettle. Hap Pruitt went back into the saloon. The Henson boys ran off toward the smithy. Within 10 minutes, the rails were empty, and only Silas was still standing by the corral, watching Ethan. "Son," Silas said, "don't." "You let her stand there." "I said don't." Silas didn't answer. He climbed the fence rail, slow, and dropped down on the other side, and walked over to the stallion at the far end of the corral. The horse let him come within 10 feet. Silas stopped there and just stood, hands at his sides, watching the animal. The stallion was still trembling. Ethan watched the two of them for a long minute, the old man and the wild horse, both of them just standing there in the cold winter sun. Then he picked up his coat from where it lay folded on the corral rail, and he put it on slowly because his ribs hurt, and he walked out of the corral and down the main street toward the doctor's office to have his jaw looked at. He did not look toward the dry goods store as he passed it, but he could feel, the way a man feels a window above him, that Clara Whitmore was at the upstairs window, looking down. He kept walking. That night the wind came down off the bighorns harder than it had in a week. The temperature dropped 20 degrees between sundown and midnight, and the snow that had been crusted on the boardwalks turned to ice, and the cattle in Doolin's pens crowded so tight against the south fence that the boards bent. At the Bar M, Silas Boone sat at the cook shack table with a cup of black coffee gone cold in front of him and watched Ethan, across the table, not eat. Ethan's jaw was bandaged. His left eye was swollen most of the way shut. He had a split in his lower lip that had needed 3 stitches from Doc Halberd, and the doc had said the loose tooth would either settle or fall out, and there was no telling which. "You gonna eat that?" Silas said. "No." "Then I will." Silas reached across and took the plate of beans and salt pork and slid it over. He ate slowly because his teeth were not what they had been. The lamp between them burned low. "He's not a mean horse," Silas said after a while. "He's something. He's scared." "Same thing." "It is not the same thing. Scared and mean are not the same thing, son. A mean horse you break. A scared horse you—" He paused. He chewed. He swallowed. "A scared horse you make a friend of. And a friend takes time. You don't got time." "I got till Friday." "You got till Friday to ride him. You don't got till Friday to make a friend of him." Ethan didn't answer. He was looking at the lamp. The flame was small and steady in the middle of the chimney, and he was trying very hard to look only at the flame and not at anything else. "I shouldn't have let him say that about her," he said. Silas put his fork down. "No," Silas said. "You shouldn't have." I didn't know what to say. Wasn't a thing to say. Was a thing to do. You step between a man and a woman he's making sport of, that's all. You don't have to be clever about it. You just have to step. Ethan rubbed his good eye with the heel of his hand. "What kind of man am I?" he said, very quietly. "If I let that horse beat me, and let that woman get laughed at, and let some Chicago suit tell me what my own town thinks of me all in one morning?" Silas was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind worked the loose tin on the bunkhouse roof. A coyote called, somewhere out past the river, and another answered it from closer in. "You're the kind of man," Silas said finally. "Your daddy was, on his worst day. Which is to say, you're still a man, and you got tomorrow." He stood up. He took his cup to the basin. He rinsed it. He did not look at Ethan. "I'd start with the woman if I was you. Horse'll keep till morning." He went out. The cook shack door banged shut behind him in the wind. Ethan sat at the table a long time after that, listening to the wind and the coyotes and the small steady sound of the lamp burning down, and thinking about a brown-haired woman walking up a main street with her chin up and a sack of flour in her arms, while a town that had never once asked her name out loud had thrown it into the dirt of a corral. He thought about the stallion's eye. He thought about how, when the horse had reared the second time, just before it struck him, the horse had been looking past him, at the crowd, at all those faces packed against the rails, at all that noise. The horse had not been trying to hurt him. The horse had been trying to get away from them. Ethan got up. He went to the window. He looked out at the corral, dark now, the stallion a darker shape against the snow at the far end of it, head down, one back hoof tipped up the way horses stand when they're at rest. The horse was not at rest. The horse had not been at rest in 2 years. Behind him, the lamp on the table guttered and went out. He stood at the window in the dark a long time. Then he went to bed, and he did not sleep, and somewhere in the small hours of the morning he understood, without being able to put it into words, that the woman and the horse were the same problem, and that he had 4 days to learn how to be the kind of man who could solve it. Outside, the wind kept coming. Morning came thin and gray, with a sky the color of dishwater and a wind that had not quit since midnight. Ethan got up before Silas did, which was no small thing, because Silas had been getting up before everyone on the Bar M for 30 years. He pulled on his boots in the cold dark of his room and went down to the kitchen and made coffee badly and drank it standing at the window. His jaw hurt. His ribs hurt. The split in his lip had reopened in the night, and there was a small dark stain on his pillow that he had not bothered to look at twice. He saddled the bay in the half-light and rode out toward town with the coffee still sour in his stomach. He had not slept. He had decided 2 things in the dark, lying on his back staring at the ceiling boards, and now in the daylight he was less sure of both of them, but he was going to do them anyway, because Silas had been right about the woman and the horse, and because there was nobody else to do it. Red Hollow was just waking up when he rode in. Smoke was beginning to climb from the chimneys. A pair of dogs were fighting over something in the alley behind the saloon. Doolin's was open already, the front door propped with a brick, because Mrs. Doolin took her stock in at 6 whether the sun was up or not. He tied the bay at the rail outside the dry goods store. He stood for a moment on the boardwalk looking up at the 2 windows above it, behind which Clara Whitmore rented her 2 rooms. There was lamplight in one of them. A figure moved past it once, and then was still. He went around to the side stairs. The stairs were narrow and steep, and the rail was loose, and at the top there was a small landing with a door that had once been painted green and was now mostly the color of old wood. He stood on the landing a long time with his hat in his hands. The wind came up the stairs behind him and pushed at the back of his coat. He could hear, faint through the door, the sound of a stove being raked and a kettle being set down. He raised his hand and knocked. The sounds inside stopped. There was a pause that lasted long enough for him to think she was not going to come. Then footsteps, light and unhurried, and the door opened a hand's breadth. Clara stood in the gap with her hand on the door and her chin lifted, the same way she had walked away from the corral the day before. She was already dressed for the day. Brown wool, a high collar, her hair pinned. Her face when she saw him did not change at all, which was somehow worse than if it had. Mr. Mercer. Miss Whitmore. It is 20 minutes to 7 in the morning. I know it. Whatever you have come to say, you might have said it at a reasonable hour. I might have. I didn't. I'm here now. She looked at him. Her eyes moved across his bandaged jaw, the swelling under his eye, the cut in his lip. Whatever she saw there did not soften her face, but it did, for an instant, make her look tired in a way she had not let herself look the day before. Come in, then, she said. I will not have my neighbors watch you stand at my door. The room was small and clean and warm. There was a stove in the corner with a kettle on it. There was a narrow bed made up tight under a quilt that had been mended in several places with careful mismatched thread. There was a table by the window with 2 chairs, and on the table an open book and a cup of tea that was still steaming. The other room he could see through a half-open door had her teaching things in it. A small slate, a stack of readers, a globe on a wooden stand with the paint worn off North America from being touched. She closed the door behind him. She did not invite him to sit down. Say what you came to say, she said. He turned his hat in his hands. He had practiced this on the ride in. He had been wrong about all of it. The words he had practiced sounded false to him now, in this clean, small room with this woman looking at him with that tired, chin-up look. I should have spoken yesterday, he said. Yes. When Pruitt said what he said, about you, I should have spoken. You should have. I didn't. I am aware. I'm telling you I'm sorry. Are you? Yes. She turned away from him. She went to the stove and lifted the kettle and poured hot water into a brown earthenware pot and set the lid on it. Her hands were steady, her back was very straight. When she spoke again, she did not turn around. Mr. Mercer, I have lived in this town for 11 years. In that time, I have been called by your townsfolk a spinster, a sad case, a leftover, a charity, and once by Mrs. Henson, that unfortunate creature. I have heard myself laughed at on the street. I have had my name written on the back of a slate by a child who did not know what it meant and was repeating what his father said at supper. I have been pitied to my face by women who would not have pitied me half so much if their own husbands had not looked at me twice at a church social in 1881. She set the kettle back on the stove. Yesterday was not the worst thing that has been said about me in this town. It was not even the worst thing that was said about me last week. So I will thank you not to come here at 20 minutes to 7 to apologize for it, as though it were some singular event that you and I will both remember the rest of our lives. He stood with his hat in his hands. All right, he said. She turned then. She looked at him with that same heat in her eyes he had seen at the corral. All right? All right, I take it back. I'm not sorry for yesterday in particular. I'm sorry for 11 years of standing by. Is that better? She looked at him a long moment. Then, surprisingly, she sat down at the table. She did not invite him to sit, but she gestured, a small flat motion of her hand at the other chair, and he understood that he could. He sat. The chair creaked under him. He laid his hat on his knee. Why are you really here, Mr. Mercer? My name is Ethan. I know your name. Why are you here? He drew a breath. It hurt his ribs. He let it out slow. That horse, he said. Ah. I'm not going to ride him by Friday. I know that now. I knew it last night. Silas told me yesterday and I didn't listen, and now my face looks like this and I still ain't ridden the horse. This is interesting to me how. You were watching him yesterday. I was watching the entire spectacle yesterday. You were watching the horse. After he threw me, I saw you. You came around the livery wall and you were looking at him and not at me, and you were looking at him the way a person looks at a thing they understand. Clara did not answer at once. She poured tea from the brown pot into the cup she had been drinking from. She did not pour any for him. I grew up on a horse farm, she said finally, in Ohio. My father bred carriage horses for a man in Cleveland. I was the oldest of 4 and the only girl until I was 9, and so I worked in the stables until I was 12, and they decided I ought to be inside learning to be a woman. I rode before I read, Mr. Mercer. I do not advertise this in Red Hollow, because Red Hollow does not require it of me. But I know horses. I know that horse. I knew him the first time I saw him in your father's wagon 2 years ago. He was frightened then, and he is frightened now, and he will go on being frightened until somebody who is not frightened of him stands beside him long enough for him to understand it. He stared at her. You knew, he said. 2 years. I knew. You never said. To whom would I have said it, Mr. Mercer? Your father, who would have thanked the schoolmarm for her opinions on his livestock. Your foreman, who has not in 11 years addressed 3 sentences to me that were not about the weather? You? You did not look at me until yesterday. He had no answer to that. I want to hire you, he said. No. I haven't said for how much. It does not matter for how much. The answer is no. Miss Whitmore. Clara. He stopped. He had not expected her to give him her name. Clara. If I lose Holloway's deal, I lose the ranch. If I lose the ranch, I lose 4 men's livelihoods and my father's grave, and the only thing in this world I am any good at. I am asking you for help. I am not too proud to ask. You are very proud, actually. You are simply proud in a way that has finally cost you something. There is a difference. All right, I am proud. I am also broke and beat and out of better ideas. Please. She looked into her teacup. What are you offering me? She said. Whatever you want. That is a foolish thing to say. Name something. He thought. He had not gotten this far in his planning. $20, he said. When Holloway pays. Mr. Mercer, I make $400 a year teaching the children of this town to spell Wyoming. $20 is not nothing to me, but it is not what I want. Then tell me what. She set the cup down. She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them was low, and the gray morning was beginning to come up at the window behind her, and her face in that light was, Ethan realized with something like a small shock, a face he had been looking at for 11 years without ever once actually seeing. I want, she said, to be spoken to in this town the way you have spoken to me in this room. Not because I have done you a kindness, not because I am a charity to your conscience, because I am a person who lives here and who has earned, by the simple fact of breathing for 38 years, the right to be addressed as one. That is what I want. That ain't something I can give you. I can't make a town speak to you anyway. No. But you can stop being one of the men who doesn't. You can speak to me on the street. You can lift your hat. You can stand in your saddle and say, Good morning, Miss Whitmore, the way you would to Mrs. Henson, who has never given you the time of day either, but has the kind of husband who buys cattle from your kind of ranch. You can do that, Mr. Mercer. You did not do it yesterday. You have not done it in 11 years. If you can do it from this morning forward, I will help you with your horse. He sat very still. That's it? That is it. That ain't nothing. It is everything. You only think it is nothing because you have never been without it. He nodded, slow, the bandage on his jaw pulled. He winced and did not bother to hide it. All right, he said. I can do that. I expect you will find it more difficult than you think. Maybe. And I will not train your horse in front of this town. I will not have them watch me put my hands on an animal and decide what kind of woman puts her hands on an animal. We will work in the corral at the Bar M before sunrise and after sundown. Nobody is to know. Not your foreman, not your hands, not your kitchen woman. Nobody. Silas would have to know. Then Silas knows and nobody else. Is that agreed? It's agreed. Then you will come for me this evening at 5 o'clock. It will be dark by 1:30. I will be ready. He stood up. He set his hat back on his head. He almost reached for the door and then stopped with his hand on the latch. Why, he said, would you do this? After yesterday. After 11 years. Clara looked at him over her teacup. Because the horse is not at fault, Mr. Mercer. The horse never has been, and I have spent 11 years watching things in this town be blamed for being what they were, never given a chance not to be. I do not intend to watch it happen to one more living thing if I can help it. He nodded. He went out. He closed the door behind him very carefully, as though the room were full of something fragile, and he went down the side stairs into the gray morning with the wind coming up the alley to meet him. He did not see her at the upstairs window this time. He did not look. But halfway down the main street, where the boardwalk passed in front of Doolin's, he met Mrs. Henson coming out with a parcel under her arm, and Mrs. Henson said, Lord, Ethan, that face! Whatever did you do to yourself?" And behind Mrs. Henson came Clara Whitmore, coming out of the side door from her stairs with her own parcel and her own business. And Ethan Mercer stopped on the boardwalk and lifted his hat clear off his head, and he said, loud enough for Mrs. Henson to hear, "Good morning, Miss Whitmore." And Clara did not slow down and did not smile, but she dipped her chin a quarter of an inch in acknowledgement and went on past. Mrs. Henson stared after her. Then she stared at Ethan. "Well," Mrs. Henson said. "Well." Ethan put his hat back on. He touched the brim to Mrs. Henson too, because manners were manners, and he walked on toward his bay at the rail, and Mrs. Henson stood in the middle of the boardwalk with her parcel against her hip and her mouth slightly open and watched him go. By supper time, half the town knew Ethan Mercer had tipped his hat to Schoolmarm Whitmore on the main street. By breakfast the next day, the other half did. He came for her at 5, as agreed. He brought the buckboard so she would not have to ride. She came down the stairs in a heavy gray cloak with the hood up and a pair of leather work gloves in her hand, and she climbed up beside him on the seat without help and without comment, and he clucked to the bay and they rolled out of town in the long blue cold of the winter dusk. They did not speak on the ride. The land was white and empty around them, and the only sounds were the squeak of the harness leather and the soft crunch of the bay's hooves in the packed snow of the road. Once a jackrabbit broke out of the sage and ran across the road in front of them, and the bay shied a little, and Clara, beside him on the seat, did not flinch. Ethan noticed that. He noticed a great many things on that ride that he had not noticed about her before. When they came in sight of the ranch, the sun was already down behind the bighorns, and the sky in the west was the color of bruised peach. Smoke was coming from the cook shack chimney. The corral by the barn was a darker shape against the snow, and at the far end of it stood the Stallion, head up, watching them come. Silas was waiting at the barn door with the lantern. Silas had been told, at noon, what was happening. Silas had looked at Ethan for a long moment and had said only, "About time somebody had the sense to ask her," and had gone back to mending a piece of harness without further comment. Now he came forward and lifted the lantern and looked at Clara as she climbed down from the buckboard. "Miss Whitmore, Mr. Boone, pleased you came." "I have not yet done anything to be pleased about, Mr. Boone, but thank you." Silas's mouth twitched. It was as close as Ethan had ever seen him come to a smile in the presence of a woman, not his late wife. "Hands are in the bunkhouse," Silas said to Ethan. "I told them you didn't want company tonight. They won't bother us." "Good." "Lanterns lit in the barn. You want it out at the corral?" Clara answered before Ethan could. "No," she said. "No lantern at the corral. He needs to see us as shapes, not as faces. The lantern will give him faces, and faces are what frighten him." Silas looked at her. He looked at Ethan. He nodded slowly and went back to the barn. Clara walked toward the corral. Ethan went with her, 2 steps behind. She did not look at him. She walked the way she had walked up the main street the morning before, with her chin lifted and her back straight, and she did not stop at the gate but went on past it along the outside of the rails until she was about 30 feet from the Stallion. There she stopped. She turned to face the horse, not square on but sideways, her shoulder pointed at him. She lowered her chin. She let her hands hang loose at her sides. The Stallion stared at her. She did nothing. For 5 minutes, she did nothing. For 10. The cold came up off the snow and into Ethan's boots, and he wanted to speak, and didn't. The Stallion's ears flicked. He stamped a hoof. He took 1 step sideways, away from her. She did not move. After 15 minutes, the horse took 1 step toward her. Ethan drew in a breath. Clara, without looking at him, made a small flat motion with her gloved hand that he understood to mean be still. The horse took another step. By the time the moon had come up white and round above the eastern ridges, the Stallion was standing 6 feet from the corral rail directly in front of Clara, with his head lowered, breath steaming, watching her with one wary brown eye. Clara had not moved. She had not spoken. She had not so much as lifted her hand. Then very slowly, she raised her right hand to her mouth and pulled the glove off with her teeth. She lowered the bare hand to her side. She turned the palm forward, fingers loose. The horse blew out, hard, through his nose, a long, shuddering breath that sent a cloud of steam between them. Then he lowered his nose and stretched it out toward her bare hand, and her bare hand did not move, and the soft black muzzle of the Stallion touched the tips of her fingers and stayed there. Behind her, Ethan Mercer stood in the snow and did not breathe. When she finally stepped back from the rail, very slowly, very quietly, the horse stayed where he was. He did not retreat to the far end of the corral. He stood with his head still low, watching her go. She walked past Ethan without stopping. She walked all the way back to the buckboard. He found her there a minute later, leaning on the wheel with one hand, her breath coming faster than she had let on, her face under the hood of the cloak pale in the moonlight. "Miss Whitmore?" "I'm all right." "You're shaking." "I'm cold." "You ain't cold. You're shaking." She looked at him then. There was something in her face he had not seen yet. Not the tiredness, not the heat. Something almost like grief. "Mr. Mercer, that horse has not been touched by a kind hand in 2 years, possibly longer. I do not know what was done to him before your father bought him. I have an idea. Whatever it was, he has carried it in his body all this time, and nobody has bothered to set it down for him. Tonight he set down a piece of it. That is what you saw. Do you understand me?" "I think so. It is not a trick. It is not a method. It is patience, and it is time, and it is the willingness to stand still while a frightened animal decides whether you are another thing that is going to hurt him. I cannot teach you patience in 4 days. I can teach you to stand still. That is what we will do tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. And by Friday? By Friday he will let you sit on his back, if he likes you well enough. Whether he will let you ride him 3 times around that corral in front of strangers, I do not know. I am not magic, Mr. Mercer. I am only the first person in 2 years who has not been in a hurry." He swallowed, his throat hurt. "Clara." "Yes." "Thank you." She looked at him for a long moment in the moonlight. "You may thank me on Friday," she said, "if we are still standing." He drove her home in the dark. They did not speak on the road back to town either, but it was a different silence than the silence on the way out. When he handed her down at the foot of her stairs, she let him take her hand for the step, which she had not done coming up, and at the door she paused with her hand on the latch. "Tomorrow at 5. Tomorrow at 5. And Mr. Mercer?" "Ma'am, they will talk. By tomorrow afternoon they will have decided what they think this is. You should prepare yourself." "Let 'em talk." "That is easy to say in the dark on my stairs. It will be less easy on the main street at noon." "I'll manage." She looked at him a moment longer. Then she went inside and closed the door, and Ethan Mercer drove the buckboard home through a country gone silver under the moon. And behind him in the corral at the Bar M, a black stallion stood at the rail and watched the place where she had stood, and did not move all night. By the time the sun came up the next morning, the talk had already started. By the time it came up the morning after that, the talk had a shape, and the shape was ugly, and it was not going to stay in Red Hollow, but was going to travel, the way these things did, all the way down the road to Cheyenne, where a man in a beaver felt hat was checking his watch and counting the hours until Friday afternoon. The talk had a shape by Wednesday morning, and the shape was this. Schoolmarm Whitmore had been seen, twice now, climbing into Ethan Mercer's buckboard at dusk and being driven out of town in the direction of the Bar M. She had not been seen coming back. That part was not strictly true. She had been coming back every night, somewhere between 9:30 and 10 o'clock. But the town had decided that the part that suited the story was that she had not been seen coming back, and so that was what got repeated. Mrs. Henson heard it first from her husband, who had heard it at the smithy from Pete Hardesty, who had not actually seen anything but had been told by Hap Pruitt that he had. Hap Pruitt had not seen anything either. Hap Pruitt had been in the saloon both evenings until past closing, but Hap Pruitt had a long memory for any time a woman had failed to laugh at one of his jokes, and Clara Whitmore had once, at the church Christmas supper in 1883, looked at him across a plate of dried apple pie with an expression that had not been hatred exactly, but had been very close to it, and Hap Pruitt had not forgotten. So by the time Ethan came into Doolin's on Wednesday morning to buy a sack of cracked corn for the stallion, the room went quiet when he walked in. Not all the way quiet. Mrs. Doolin kept counting nails into a paper sack for old man Bell, and Bell kept watching the nails, and over by the stove 2 of the Henson boys kept arguing about a knife one of them had lost. But the conversation at the counter stopped, and 3 of the women standing there turned their heads just enough to see him without quite looking at him, and one of them, a woman named Ruth Pickett, who taught the choir at the church and considered herself a friend of Mrs. Henson, said, not quite under her breath, "Well, here he is." Ethan touched his hat. "Mrs. Pickett, Mrs. Doolin, Mrs. Henson." "Mr. Mercer," said Mrs. Doolin. Her voice was a degree cooler than it had been on Monday. Mrs. Doolin had known Ethan since he was 8 years old. She had given him candy from a jar on this very counter when he was 12, and his mother had died. She had cooked at his father's funeral. "I need a sack of cracked corn," he said, "and a tin of axle grease." "The corn's in the back. Hardesty'll fetch it." "Obliged." He stood at the counter while she went to call for Hardesty. He did not look at the three women. He could feel them looking at him. He could feel, particularly, Ruth Pickett looking at him. And after a moment, Ruth Pickett cleared her throat the way a woman clears her throat when she has decided to say a thing and has worked out exactly how she is going to say it. "Ethan." "Mrs. Pickett." "I don't suppose it's any business of mine." "Probably not, ma'am. But Clara Whitmore has been a guest in my house at supper 4 times in the last 2 years. And I consider her, in my way, a friend, and I would not be the woman my mother raised me to be if I did not say something." He turned to face her. He kept his hat in his hands. "Say it then, ma'am." She was not a small woman. She had a wide, soft face and pale blue eyes and a way of pressing her lips together before she spoke that made every sentence sound rehearsed. "That woman has lived in this town 11 years. She has not given any of us cause to doubt her character. She is a teacher of children. She is alone in the world. And whatever you may need from her in the way of assistance, with that horse of yours, or your business, or whatever it is, there is a way to ask a woman for help that does not require her to be driven out of town in a buckboard at dusk." "I see." "Do you?" "I think I do, ma'am. Because you are not the first man in this country to find a use for a woman nobody else has a use for, Mr. Mercer. And you will not be the last, and I will tell you what I have told my own son in a similar situation. Whatever you are doing with her, you can do at noon in the daylight, with her standing on the ground in front of God and her neighbors, and not in a wagon at the side of a dark road. And if you cannot do it in the daylight, then you should not be doing it at all." Mrs. Henson had not spoken. She was looking at the floor. The other woman, whose name Ethan could not at that moment recall, was looking at him with open interest, the way people look at a fight that has just broken out in front of them. He stood with the brim of his hat turning slowly in his fingers. "Mrs. Pickett, you and me have known each other a long time." "We have." "You taught me my catechism when I was 9. "I did. So I'm going to take what you just said as kindly as I can. I'm going to take it as a thing a friend of hers said because she was worried about her. I'm going to take it that way and not the other way." "And what is the other way, Mr. Mercer?" "The other way," he said, "is that you have stood at this counter every Wednesday morning for 11 years and have not once asked Clara Whitmore to your house at supper, and now that you have decided she is being misused, you are very ready to put your name to the cause. I do not think that is what you are doing. I am saying I am choosing to believe that is not what you are doing, out of respect for the woman who taught me my catechism." The silence after that was different from the silence when he had walked in. Mrs. Henson, who had been staring at the floor, looked up. The third woman, whose name Ethan still could not place, took a small step backward as though to be out of the way of something falling. Ruth Pickett's color came up in 2 patches high on her cheeks. "Mr. Mercer, I'm not doing anything with that woman, Mrs. Pickett, except being taught by her how to handle a horse that has been frightened in ways I do not understand, by methods that require us to be at the ranch in the cold and the dark because the horse is afraid of crowds. That is what I am doing. I would tell anyone who asked, if they asked me, and not the air around me. Now I will take my corn and my axle grease, Mrs. Doolin, if it pleases you, and I will go." Mrs. Doolin had come back to the counter. She set the tin of grease down between them without quite looking at him. "It's on the slate," she said. I'll mark it." "Obliged." He paid for the corn when Hardesty brought it from the back. He carried the sack out on his shoulder and tied it behind the cantle of his saddle. He stood for a moment at his horse's head on the boardwalk in the cold sun, and he looked down the street toward the dry goods store, and he did not see Clara at any window. He hoped she was at the schoolhouse already. He hoped, very briefly and with a kind of shame, that none of what had just been said at the counter had been heard from above. He mounted up. He rode out of town the long way, past the schoolhouse, and he saw the smoke coming from the schoolhouse chimney and the smaller children running in the yard at recess in their coats. And one of the smallest ones, a girl named Lou Henson, who was 8 years old and the youngest of the Henson clan, saw him and waved with her whole arm, and he lifted his hat to her. She kept waving until he was past the bend. He rode back to the Bar M with the cracked corn jouncing against the bay's flank, and he did not feel as much like a man who had just defended a woman's name in public as he had thought he would feel. That afternoon, the 4 o'clock stage from Cheyenne came in early on account of a tailwind, and Augustus Holloway stepped down from it without his associates. He was traveling alone this trip. He had taken a room at the hotel for 2 nights. He had not sent word ahead. He sat in the hotel dining room with a pot of coffee and a small plate of cold beef, and he listened. He did not have to ask. The hotel dining room at 4 in the afternoon was full of women coming in from afternoon visits, and the talk that had been making its way around Red Hollow for 2 days now was at his table by the time he had finished his second cup. He listened with his face very mild. He nodded once or twice. He did not ask questions. He let it come to him. By the time he had finished his coffee, he had decided what he was going to do. He rode out to the Bar M at 5 o'clock in a hired buggy. He came down the long lane between the snow fences at exactly the moment Ethan Mercer was hitching up his own buckboard to go into town and fetch Clara, and the 2 vehicles met in the yard in front of the barn, and Ethan stopped with one hand still on the harness and the other on his horse's nose, and Holloway pulled up his hired team and sat with the reins resting across his thigh and looked down at him. "Mr. Mercer, Mr. Holloway, I wasn't expecting you till Friday. I'm aware. Something the matter?" "That depends, I suppose, on what we mean by the matter." Holloway swung down from the buggy. He did it stiffly. He was not a young man. He stamped his boots on the frozen ground and pulled his gloves on tighter. "Is there somewhere we might speak?" Silas had come out of the barn at the sound of the buggy. He stood in the barn doorway with a curry comb in one hand and his face entirely blank, which was the face he made when he was paying close attention. "The cook shack," Ethan said. "Silas, finish hitching the bay for me, if you'd be so kind. I'm running late." "Yes, sir." The cook shack was warm. The big iron stove was going for supper, and the smell of beans and onion frying was thick in the air. And Bess, the woman who cooked at the Bar M 3 days a week, was at the stove with her back to them and a dishcloth over her shoulder. She did not turn around when they came in, but she stopped stirring the pan, which meant she was listening. Ethan poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Holloway and sat down across from him. "Speak your piece, Mr. Holloway." Holloway took his time. He pulled off his gloves 1 finger at a time and laid them on the table beside his cup. He took a sip of the coffee. He set the cup down. "I have spent the afternoon in your town, Mr. Mercer." "I see. I have heard a great deal." "I expect you have. I came out here today, frankly, to tell you that the arrangement is finished. I had heard enough by my second cup of coffee to write the check to Vernon Pratt in my head. I will tell you this plainly because we are both men and there is no purpose in dancing. A school teacher of a certain age, driven out to your ranch after dark, 2 nights running. The talk is what the talk always is in a town like this. I will not put my syndicate's money behind a man whose name is in the mouth of every woman in his county before lunch." Ethan said nothing. He had his hands wrapped around his cup. The cup was hot. He let it be hot. "However," Holloway said, "however, on the ride out here I had time to think, and I would like to put a proposition to you, Mr. Mercer, that may answer all our difficulties at once. I would like you to listen to it before you speak." "All right." "You marry her." The cook shack was very quiet for a moment. Bess at the stove had not moved. "You marry her," Holloway said again, "and the whole matter changes shape. The talk dies on Sunday. By the following Sunday, the women who were calling her names are calling her Mrs. Mercer. By the spring, nobody remembers anything except that the rancher Mercer married the school teacher in a quiet ceremony in January, and there is a respectable household at the Bar M, and my cattle have a respectable place to winter. The arrangement stands. The $800 is in your hand by Friday week. The partnership goes forward in spring. The horse, frankly, ceases to matter. I will tell my associates the horse was a test of character and you passed it. They will accept that because I will tell them to accept it." Ethan stared at him. "You came out here to tell me to marry her." "I came out here to tell you that the only way I see this arrangement surviving is if you marry her. I did not invent the situation, Mr. Mercer. The situation was invented for me by your fellow citizens. I am simply offering you a way through it. That woman has not agreed to marry me. That woman is 38 years old and unmarried, Mr. Mercer, and is currently the subject of talk in every kitchen in Red Hollow. She will agree. You don't know her. I do not need to know her. I have known 40 women in her position in 23 years of business in this country. They always agree. They agree because there is no other door. I do not say that cruelly. I say it as a matter of fact." Ethan looked down at his coffee. He looked up. "And if I say no, then I write the check to Vernon Pratt on Friday afternoon, and you and I shake hands like men. and never do business again. I have no quarrel with you, Mr. Mercer. I rather like you, but I cannot help you if you will not be helped." Holloway picked up his gloves. He did not put them on. He sat with them folded across his palm. "I will be at the hotel until Friday morning. I would like an answer by Friday at noon. If the answer is yes, I will stand as a witness at the courthouse myself, and I will hand you the check across the desk afterward. If the answer is no, do not bother to come into town. I will know what it means." He stood up. He pulled on his gloves. He inclined his head a quarter inch. "Mr. Mercer." "Mr. Holloway." He went out. The cook shack door banged once behind him in the wind. Bess at the stove had not moved through any of it. Now she lifted her wooden spoon and began stirring again, very slowly, and she did not turn around. Ethan sat with his coffee a long time before he got up. He went out to the buckboard. Silas had the bay hitched and was standing at the horse's head, holding the bridle. The old foreman did not ask. Ethan did not tell him. He climbed up on the seat and took the lines. "Don't wait supper for me." "I wasn't planning to." He drove into town with the wind at his back and a knot under his breastbone that he could not put a name to. He pulled up in front of the dry goods store at exactly 5 o'clock. Clara came down the side stairs with her gray cloak and her gloves and her quiet, steady face, and she climbed up beside him without a word, and they rolled out of town in the long blue dusk just as they had the night before. Half a mile out, where the road bent past the cottonwoods on the river, he pulled up. She looked at him. "Mr. Mercer." "Clara, you are not driving." "No." "Why?" He told her. He told her sitting on the buckboard seat with the bay standing in the harness, blowing steam, and the cottonwoods creaking in the wind around them, and the sky going from peach to deep cold blue overhead. He told her what Holloway had said in the cook shack, with Bess at the stove. He told her the exact words. He did not soften them, and he did not arrange them. He told her about Ruth Pickett at the counter at Doolin's that morning. He told her about Mrs. Henson, looking at the floor. She listened. She did not interrupt. She kept her hands folded in her lap and her face very still under the hood of her cloak. When he was done, she did not speak for a long moment, and then she said, "I see." "Clara, chum, drive on, please." "Clara, I haven't said—" "You have not asked me anything yet, Mr. Mercer. When you ask me something, I will answer. For now, I would like to go and work the horse, if you would be so kind, because I gave you my word that I would, and I keep my word. Drive on." He drove on. They did not speak the rest of the way. When they came into the ranch yard, the corral was already silver under the rising moon, and the stallion was standing at the near rail, watching for them, the way he had begun to do on the second night. Clara climbed down from the buckboard before Ethan could come around to help her. She walked to the corral. She took her glove off with her teeth and held her bare hand out to the rail, and the stallion came to her, slow, lowering his head, and his black muzzle touched her fingers and stayed. She put her hand very gently on the side of his face. The horse closed his eyes. She stood there a long minute with her bare hand on the side of a horse that had not been touched in 2 years, and Ethan stood 10 feet behind her in the snow and watched. Then she turned. Her face in the moonlight was wet down both cheeks. "Mr. Mercer." "Ma'am?" "Ask me then. Get it over with." He took his hat off. He held it against his chest, the way men in this country held their hats at funerals and at weddings and at the doors of women they were about to lie to. "Clara Whitmore, will you marry me? For the reasons Mr. Holloway said, and for no other reasons I can think to give you tonight in front of this horse, in this yard. Will you marry me?" She looked at him a long time. The wind moved a strand of hair across her cheek. She did not lift her hand to push it away. "No," she said. "Clara?" "No, Mr. Mercer." "Clara, the ranch. The ranch is yours, and you will save it or you will lose it. The horse is yours, and he will be ridden or he will not. My hand is mine, Mr. Mercer, and it is not a tool to repair a broken business arrangement, and I would have thought that after 2 nights of standing in this snow with me, you would have understood at least that much." "I do understand it, I do, but he ain't wrong. The talk is going to do what the talk has done for 11 years, which is to follow me into rooms and out of them. It is no worse tonight than it was on Monday. It is only louder. I have lived with louder before." "Clara, I'm asking you because there ain't no other way." "Then there is no other way, Mr. Mercer. I am sorry for your ranch. I am sorry for your father's name on the deed. I am sorry I cannot save it for you by putting mine next to it on a paper at the courthouse to make a man from Cheyenne feel that his money is in respectable hands. I am not for sale to repair anybody's reputation, including yours, including, most particularly, my own. He stood with his hat against his chest. All right, he said. All right? All right, I asked. You answered. I won't ask again. You will be ruined. I'll be ruined then. Mr. Mercer. My father went broke twice before he died. He used to say a man could go broke as many times as it took, but he could only sell his name once. I'd as soon not sell mine to a man in a beaver hat to keep some grass under cattle that ain't even mine. If that's vanity, I'm sorry for it, but it's what I've got. She looked at him for a long time. The wet on her cheeks had not dried. The strand of hair was still across her face. Drive me home, please. We ain't worked the horse yet. We are not going to work the horse tonight, Mr. Mercer. I cannot. I am sorry. Drive me home. He drove her home. He did not try to speak on the road. At the foot of the side stairs, he handed her down, and she did not let him take her hand this time. She climbed the stairs without looking back, and the door at the top opened and closed, and the lamp in the upper window came on, and then, a minute later, went out. And Ethan Mercer sat in the buckboard in the dark street of Red Hollow, with the bay blowing patient white plumes into the cold. And he understood that he had asked a thing of a woman that no man had a right to ask, and that he had not made it any better by saying the words out loud, and that whatever the next 2 days held, there was no version of them now in which he and Clara Whitmore would stand together in the corral at the Bar M before sunrise. He drove back to the ranch the long way. The moon was high and small and white. The snow on the road shone like beaten tin. When he came into the yard, Silas was at the barn door with a lantern, waiting. The old foreman looked at him as he climbed down. "Where's Miss Whitmore?" "She ain't coming." "Tonight?" "At all." Silas studied him. "What did you do, son?" "What I had to." "What was that?" Ethan did not answer. He walked past the foreman into the dark of the barn, and somewhere far off across the pasture, a coyote called once and was answered, and in the corral by the barn the black stallion stood at the rail and watched the empty yard. And he did not move from the rail all night, not when the moon went down behind the bighorns, and not when the eastern sky began to gray, and the wind off the mountains came up harder than it had come up in a month. And far to the west, a wall of cloud the color of slate began to climb above the ridge and roll east. The wall of cloud was over the bighorns by sunup, and over the south pasture by noon. And by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Silas Boone stood at the corner of the barn and watched the sky and said, to nobody in particular, that he had not seen one come down out of those mountains that fast since the winter of '79. Ethan had not slept. He had sat at the kitchen table until the lamp went out, and then he had sat in the dark. And somewhere around 3 he had lain down on top of the quilt with his boots still on and stared at the ceiling boards. He had gotten up at 5 and gone out and put hay in the corral by hand because the stallion would not let any of the hired men close enough to the rail to do it. The horse had stood 10 feet away from him while he forked the hay in. It had not come to the rail. It had not come to him. He had told Silas at breakfast that the deal was off. He had said the words flat across the table with the coffee untouched in front of him. Silas had taken it without speaking for a long minute, and then he had said, "Did you tell her that's what you decided?" "I told her I wouldn't ask again." "That ain't the same thing, son." "It's close enough." "It ain't close at all. A woman knows the difference." Ethan had not answered. He had pushed back from the table and gone out, and Silas had let him go. Now it was past 2 in the afternoon, and the sky over the bighorns was the color of a bruise, and the wind, which had been coming hard all morning, had begun to do the thing the wind did in this country when something worse was on the way, which was to drop. It went still in the yard the way a held breath goes still. The horses in the pasture lifted their heads. The chickens went into the coop on their own. "Get the stock in," Silas said. He did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. The 2 hands who were standing nearest him broke and ran for the gate of the south pasture without being told twice. The third, a kid named Travers, who was 18 and from Missouri and had never seen real Wyoming weather, stood looking at the sky with his mouth slightly open until Silas swung the back of his hand against his shoulder and said, "Move." And he moved. Ethan came out of the barn with a coil of rope in his hand. "What about him?" "Leave him." "In the corral?" "That corral's the strongest fence on the place. He's better off in there than loose. He gets out, you ain't catching him in this. Leave him." "Silas, Leave him and get the doors of the barn shut. Both of them. And go out and tell Bess to come up to the house and not to go back to her cabin tonight. You hear me?" He heard. He went. By 3 o'clock, the snow had started. It did not fall the way snow ordinarily fell in this country, in big slow flakes coming down out of a heavy gray sky. It came sideways, fine and hard and dry as sand, hitting the side of the bunkhouse with a sound like sugar being poured on a tin plate. By 3:30, the sky over the south ridge had gone from slate to black, and the wind was up again, and the temperature, which had been at 15 degrees at noon, was dropping a degree every few minutes. In the corral by the barn, the black stallion was at the rail nearest the yard, head up, ears working, every line of him strung tight. Ethan came across the yard with his coat collar up and his hat tied down. He had the rope still over his shoulder. He stopped at the corral and looked at the horse, and the horse looked at him, and for the first time in 2 years there was no fear in the look. There was something else. A request. Ethan did not have any other word for it. The horse was asking him for a thing, and Ethan did not know what. "I'm sorry, fella," he said low. "Best I can do for you is leave you the lee of the barn." He did not put his hand on the rail. He had not earned that. He turned away. That was when he saw the buckboard coming down the lane. It was Bess's buggy, the small one with the bent shaft, and it was being driven by Bess herself, and the snow was already piling on her shoulders and on the back of the chestnut mare she had hitched, and beside her on the buggy seat with her hood up and her hands gripping the rail was Clara Whitmore. Ethan crossed the yard at a run. Bess pulled up at the cook shack. "Found her on the road," she called down without preamble. "Walking, about a mile out. Said she couldn't get the livery to rent her a horse on account of the storm, and she set out on foot." "On foot?" "Don't yell at me, Mercer. I ain't the one walked 4 miles in a January storm. Yell at her if you got to yell. I'm putting up this horse." Clara climbed down from the buggy by herself. She did not look at him. Her face under the hood was the color of skim milk, and her gloves were wet through, and she was shaking in a way she could not control and was trying to pretend she was not. "Clara." "Inside, Mr. Mercer. I will speak to you inside if it is all the same to you." He took her by the elbow. She did not pull away. He half led, half walked her up onto the cook shack porch and into the warm. Bess came in behind them with a stamping and a stripping of mittens, and the door slammed twice in the wind before it caught. He sat Clara down by the stove. He pulled the wet gloves off her hands 1 finger at a time. Her fingers were dead white at the tips. He put them between his own palms and held them there, and she did not pull her hands away, and she did not look at him. "Why?" he said. "Why would you do this?" "Because I changed my mind." He stopped. "About what?" "About a great many things. About one in particular." She drew in a long, unsteady breath. "I have spent the night and the morning thinking, Mr. Mercer, and I have decided that I do not wish to be the woman who let a man lose his father's land because she was too proud to let him say the words he said to me last night in the snow. I do not wish to marry you for a man in a beaver hat, but I do not wish either to be the reason you go under. I came to tell you that if you ask me again, in the daylight, in front of your foreman, with no Mr. Holloway sitting at any hotel in the town, I will say yes, not because I owe you anything, because I would rather choose to do it than be the thing you blamed afterward for not doing it. Clara, I am not finished. If you do not ask me again, that is also acceptable to me. But you should know that I came. You should know that I came in this weather. I do not wish to be admired for it, and I do not wish to be thanked for it. I wish only for you to know that it was offered. What you do with it is your business." He held her hands a long time. He could not look at her. He looked at the stove instead. "I didn't think you'd come." "No, I didn't sleep last night thinking you wouldn't come." "You and I are very stupid people, Mr. Mercer." "Yeah, I expect we are." Behind them, Bess at the door said, "Lord, the wind." It was no longer a wind. It was something past a wind. The cook shack windows were rattling in their frames, and the door, which had been latched, was straining against the latch like a thing alive, and the lamp on the table was guttering in the draft that was coming up through the floorboards. Outside, the yard had gone almost white in the late afternoon. The barn, which was 40 feet from the cook shack, was a gray shape in the snow. Past it, the corral was a shape Ethan could only half make out. Then he heard it. The sound a horse makes when a horse is past frightened and into something worse, high and broken, and under it the splintering crack of a board going. He was at the door before he knew he was moving. "Ethan!" Bess shouted. "Ethan, don't!" He had the door open. The wind took it and slammed it against the wall, and the cold came in like a hand. He was out on the porch and down the steps and crossing the yard at a stumble before Silas, coming out of the barn with a lantern, saw him and shouted, "Stay back! The corral! I know! Stay back!" The corral, when Ethan got to it, was coming apart. The south side, which took the wind straight off the ridge, had a board down already, and a second one was hanging from one nail and beating against the post in the gusts. And the stallion was at the far end of the corral, going up and coming down and screaming, and beyond him, in the half paddock attached to the corral where the 4 working horses were kept. The working horses were all on their feet and turning in tight panicked circles, and the gate between the corral and the paddock, which had been latched, was rattling in a way that meant the latch was going to go. If the latch went, all 5 horses would be loose in the storm. If 5 horses came loose in this storm, they would run, because horses ran from storms. They would run blind, and they would run hard, and they would run until they hit something, the fence at the far end of the south pasture, or the river, or the barbed wire along the road. And they would not stop, because that was what horses did in country like this, in weather like this. And Ethan had seen the aftermath of it twice in his life, and had not wanted to see it a third. He went over the rail of the corral. He did not think about it. He landed in snow up to his knees on the inside and stumbled and caught himself on the post, and the stallion at the far end saw him and reared, and Ethan saw the whites of the horse's eyes the way he had seen them on Monday in town, and he understood that the stallion did not recognize him through the snow and the dark and the noise. The stallion saw a shape, and the shape was the shape of a man, and a man was the thing he was afraid of. He came down running. He came down running, and the gate at the back of the corral, the gate between corral and paddock, chose that moment to go. The latch sheared. The gate banged once against its post and was caught by the wind, and the 4 working horses on the other side bolted forward into the corral as one body, and the stallion, instead of going through the broken board at the south rail and out into the open, swung sideways to meet them, and Ethan was suddenly standing in the middle of 5 panicked horses in a corral with one wall down and the wind coming through the gap like a freight train. He did not have time to be afraid. The bay he had ridden to town and back, his bay, the one he had grown up on, came past him close enough to clip his shoulder, and he was knocked sideways into the snubbing post, and his boot caught on something below the snow, and his ankle turned under him, and he went down hard on his hip with his right leg folded under him wrong, and he heard the bone go before he felt it. The pain came a beat later. He made a sound he was not proud of. He tried to roll. He couldn't. The leg would not do anything he asked it to. He got his elbows under him and lifted his head, and 4 horses went around him in a tight circle, and the stallion went around the outside of them, and the snubbing post was between him and the broken rail, and that was the only reason he was not already trampled. Past the corral, he could hear Silas shouting. He could hear, very faint under the wind, his name being called, and another voice that was not Silas's, a woman's voice. He understood with a far-off kind of clarity that Clara was outside the cook shack now, that Clara was at the rail of the corral, and he wanted very badly to yell at her to get back inside, but he did not have the breath for it. "Clara!" That was Silas, close now. "Miss Whitmore, get away from there." "Where is he?" "He's down. He's in there. Don't you go in." She did not answer. Ethan, from where he lay, saw her shape come along the outside of the corral, gray cloak whipping, hood blown back, hair coming down out of its pins. She did not run. She walked. She walked the way she had walked away from the corral on Monday afternoon, with her chin up and her back straight, in a place where everything was telling her to run. She came to the broken board at the south rail. She put her hand on the post above it. She stepped over. "Clara," Ethan said, not loud. "Clara, get out." She did not look at him. She looked at the stallion. The stallion was at the far rail of the corral. He had stopped circling. He had turned to face the gap where the gate had been, and the 4 working horses were piling up against him there, and any second now they would all break through and they would all be gone, and the stallion was the lead. The stallion was deciding. Ethan could see him deciding. The horse's whole body was strung between bolting and not bolting, and the wind was screaming and the snow was coming sideways, and the temperature had to be below 0 by now, and the stallion was looking at the gap in the rail with an animal's whole attention. Clara took her gloves off. She did not pull them off with her teeth this time. She pulled them off finger by finger, slow, and dropped them in the snow. She walked toward the horse. Not fast, not slow, steady. Her bare hands were down at her sides. She did not say anything that Ethan could hear. The wind was too loud, but he could see her mouth moving. She was talking to the horse the way she had talked to the horse on Monday night and again on Tuesday night, and the horse was not seeing her yet because the horse was looking at the gap. She kept walking. She was 10 feet from him. 5, 3. The stallion's head swung toward her. For a moment that Ethan would remember for the rest of his life, the horse and the woman stood in the white screaming chaos of the corral and looked at one another, and nothing else moved. The 4 working horses behind the stallion stopped. They stopped circling. They stopped piling. They stood with their heads up and their nostrils flaring, and they waited to see what their leader did. Because that was the other thing horses did in country like this. They followed. Clara raised her right hand. She turned the palm forward, fingers loose, the way she had done on Monday night at the rail. The stallion lowered his nose. He stretched his neck toward her, slow and trembling, and his black muzzle touched her bare fingers, and her bare fingers slid up the bridge of his nose and onto the broad flat bone between his eyes. And she leaned her forehead against the forehead of the horse and stood like that for the space of one long breath in a wind that was trying to take her down. When she lifted her head, she had hold of his halter. She had hold of it with one hand. She did not pull. She turned slow in the snow, and she took one step away from the gap, and the stallion came with her. The 4 working horses, watching, came with him. She led all 5 of them in a slow, short line across the corral and into the lee of the barn wall where the wind was broken, and they followed her like she was a thing they had always known and had been waiting their whole lives to be led by. She got them into the corner. She turned the stallion in toward the wall and let go of the halter and put her hand flat on his shoulder, and the horse stood. The other 4 behind him stood. Then she walked back across the corral to Ethan. She knelt in the snow beside him. Her face was very close to his. He had not realized he was shaking until he saw her face. Her hair was down around her shoulders, and there was snow in it, and her eyes were the largest he had ever seen them. "Where?" she said. "Right leg." "Below the knee or above?" "Above." "Felt it go." She put her hand on his chest, just laid it there. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she turned her head and called toward the broken rail, sharp. "Mr. Boone, I need you and one other man. Now please." Silas was already coming. He was over the rail before she finished speaking, with Travers behind him, white-faced and stumbling. The 2 of them got Ethan up between them. The leg did not want to bear any weight at all. Ethan made the sound again and bit down on it. Clara walked ahead of them through the snow toward the cook shack, with the wind at her back and her hair loose, and Bess was at the porch with the door open and a lamp held up in the white. And they got him inside and onto the long table that was used for cutting biscuits, and Bess shoved everything off it onto the floor without ceremony. "Doc," Silas said, "we got to get the doc." "Not in this," Bess said. "Nobody's riding to town in this." "Then we set it ourselves." "You ain't setting nothing, Silas Boone. You can hardly see straight." "I will set it," Clara said. They both looked at her. "I have set a horse's leg," she said, "twice. A man's is not so different. Bess, I need 2 flatboards about so long, and I need every clean strip of linen in this house, and I need a bottle of whiskey if there is one. Mr. Boone, I need you to hold his shoulders. I will need you, young man." This to Travers, who looked about to faint. "To hold his good leg by the ankle. I will need you to not be sick on him while you do it. Is that clear?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She was already pushing the wet sleeve of Ethan's coat back to feel along the bone above his knee. Her hand was steady. It had not been steady when she had walked in the door an hour ago and let him hold her fingers between his palms. It was steady now. "This is going to be very bad, Mr. Mercer," she said. "I know it." "I would like you to look at me, please, and not at what I am doing." He looked at her. The lamp was behind her, and her face was half in shadow, and her hair was loose, and there was still snow melting in it. He looked at her, and Silas's hands closed on his shoulders, and Travers's hands closed on his good ankle, and Clara took the leg in both her hands and said, very softly now, and pulled. The world went white at the edges. Then it went black. Then it set. When he came back to himself, the lamp was still burning, and his right leg was straight and splinted between 2 pieces of pine board with linen wound tight around them, and there was the taste of whiskey at the back of his throat. And Clara Whitmore was sitting on a chair beside the table with her hand resting on his forearm. Her hair was still down. She had not bothered to pin it up. "You're back." "How long?" "Not long. A few minutes." "The horses." "In the barn. Mr. Boone got them in once the worst gust passed." "The stallion. In the barn with the rest." He walked in beside Mr. Boone like he had been doing it his whole life. He closed his eyes. He opened them. Holloway. Mr. Mercer. Holloway's going to come tomorrow, and there ain't going to be no ride. There was never going to be a ride tomorrow, Mr. Mercer. There was going to be a wedding. And there is still not going to be a wedding, because I have changed my mind again, and I'm going to tell you why. I would prefer to tell you why now, before you fall asleep on me, because I do not wish to have to say it twice. He turned his head toward her. His mouth tasted of whiskey and copper. He waited. I came out here in this storm, she said, to offer myself to you as a way of saving your ranch. I would have done it. I had decided it on the walk. I had decided that pride was a thing I could afford less than you could, and that I would marry you on Friday and let the town think what it thought, and let the man from Cheyenne write his check, and I would have lived with it. But I will tell you what I saw in that corral when I came over the rail. I saw a man who had broken his leg trying to protect a frightened animal from a worse fate. I did not see a man who needed a wife to make him respectable to a stranger. I saw a man who was already, in the only way that matters, the kind of man a woman might be proud to stand beside. And I will not stand beside that man because a man in a hotel told us to. I will stand beside him because I choose to, or I will not stand beside him at all. Do you understand the difference, Mr. Mercer? I understand it. Then there will be no wedding tomorrow. Mr. Holloway will come, and you will tell him what happened in this corral, and you will tell him that I will not be marrying you tomorrow or any other day on his account, and he will do what he does. And whatever he does, I will be here at this ranch through the worst of the winter, because you cannot work with that leg, and there is a horse in your barn who has only just decided to trust people, and I will not have him untrusted again on account of your hired men being clumsy with him. That is all. That is what I came to say. He looked at her. The lamp was guttering low. Outside, the wind was still going, but it had a different sound now, a tired sound, the sound of a storm that had spent itself. Clara. Yes. Will you marry me anyway? After. When the leg's healed and the cattle are gone and the horses rode and there ain't no man from Cheyenne anywhere in the county. Will you marry me then? Not for nothing, just because I'm asking. She did not answer for a long moment. Ask me again then, she said. When that day comes, ask me then, and I will answer then. All right. All right. She did not move her hand from his forearm. He closed his eyes. He did not mean to sleep, but the whiskey and the long bad day and the pain in his leg took him under, and the last thing he was aware of was Clara's hand on his arm and Silas somewhere at the stove putting wood in it, and outside the wind dying down at last over a corral with one wall gone and a paddock gate broken off its hinges and the moon coming pale and small through the breaking clouds over the ridge of the Bighorns to the west. The wind died sometime before dawn, and by the time the eastern sky began to gray over the Bighorns, the yard at the Bar M was a country of fresh drifts and broken boards, and a strange new quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after weather that has spent itself and gone on east. The Stallion stood in a corner of the barn with the 4 working horses ranked behind him, and not one of them moved when Silas Boone came down the aisle with a lantern at first light. The old foreman stopped at the stall door and looked at the black horse for a long moment, and the black horse looked back, and Silas said softly, "Well, all right then," and went out to put on coffee. Ethan slept on the long table in the cook shack until past 8. Bess had thrown a wool blanket over him and a folded sack under his head, and Clara had moved to the bench by the stove and slept sitting upright with her chin on her chest, the way people sleep when they do not mean to be sleeping. When she opened her eyes, the light at the window was the color of pewter, and the fire in the stove had burned down low, and Silas was standing at the door taking his hat off. "He's coming. Mr. Holloway. Just saw the buggy turn off the main road. He'll be in the yard in 20 minutes. Clara stood up. Her hair was still down. She put both hands to it and began, by feel, to twist it back into its pins, and her hands were stiff and slow, and her fingers would not do what she asked of them. She gave up after a minute and let it stay loose over her shoulder. "Wake him." "You sure?" "I am very sure, Mr. Boone." Silas went to the table. He put his hand on Ethan's good shoulder, gentle as he could. "Son." Ethan came up out of it with a jerk that hurt his leg and made him swear, and Silas held him down with a hand flat on his chest until he understood where he was. The pain came back in pieces. His mouth tasted as if a horse had stood in it. He looked at Silas's face, and then past him at the window, and then he saw Clara at the stove. and his face did a small involuntary thing he could not have controlled if he tried. "Holloway," Silas said. "How long?" "Quarter hour." "Help me sit up." "Son, you ain't sitting up for that man." "Yes, I am. Help me up." Silas looked at Clara. Clara looked at Silas. Clara said, "Help him up." They got him sitting against the wall behind the table with a folded coat at his back and his splinted legs straight out in front of him on a chair. Bess brought coffee. He drank half of it scalding hot because he needed his head clear, and then he put the cup down and looked at Clara across the room. "Whatever I say to him." "I'm not telling you what to say to him." "I know you ain't. I'm telling you, whatever I say to him, it's mine to say. You don't owe him a word. You don't owe him your face in the room. You can be back at the stove you want." "I will be where I want to be, Mr. Mercer. I have not crossed a country in a storm to stand at a stove." He nodded. He did not smile. There was nothing in him that morning that was capable of smiling, but he wanted her to know he had heard her, and she did. Augustus Holloway's hired buggy came into the yard at 8:20. He climbed down stiffly. He took in the broken south rail of the corral and the splintered gate of the paddock and the drifts piled 3 feet against the lee side of the barn, and his face moved through a calculation that did not show, but that Ethan, watching through the cook shack window, could read like print. By the time Holloway came up onto the porch and Silas opened the door for him, the man's face had settled back into the same mild, interested look he had worn at the rail of the corral on Monday. "Mr. Mercer." He stopped just inside the door. He took in the table, the splinted leg, the loose hair of the woman by the stove, the smell of whiskey and wood smoke and lamp oil that had not been aired out of the room. "I see I have come at an inconvenient hour." "You've come at the only hour there is, Mr. Holloway. Sit down." "I will stand, I think." "Suit yourself." Holloway did not move from the doorway. He turned his hat in his hands. It was the same gesture Ethan had made at Clara's door 3 mornings ago, and Ethan understood distantly that they were not so different. A man holding his hat in front of a person who was about to decide whether his life would proceed the way he had planned it or not. "I will be brief," Holloway said. "I came to hear an answer. I see I do not need to hear it. The corral is broken. You are broken. There will be no ride this afternoon. I think we both know what that means." "You're wrong about the corral." "How so?" "The corral's broke. The horses ain't. Every horse on this place is in the barn this morning. The stallion you bet a partnership on walked in there on his own legs and let my foreman shut a door behind him." "Mr. Mercer." "I ain't finished. You came out here Tuesday night and you sat at this table and you told me to marry that woman to keep your money in the deal. You said it like you was offering me a kindness. You said it because you thought she would say yes on account of her age and her position. She didn't. She said no, in the snow, to my face, when nobody but a horse was listening. Then she walked 4 miles in a blizzard yesterday to tell me she had changed her mind for my sake, and then she changed it back for her own. And what I'm telling you, Mr. Holloway, is that that woman is sitting at that stove in my cook shack right now, not because of anything you said or didn't say, but because she chose to be there. And there ain't a check in your pocket big enough to make me sign a paper that takes that choice away from her." Holloway was quiet. He did not look at Clara. He looked at Ethan. "You are turning down $800, Mr. Mercer." "I am." "You are turning down a partnership worth, by spring, considerably more than that." "I am." "You will lose this ranch." "Maybe. Maybe not. My father went broke twice. He used to say a man could go broke as many times as it took. I expect I'll find out if he was right." "You are a fool." "I might be. I ain't a worse one than I was on Monday." Holloway looked then at Clara. She was sitting on the bench by the stove with her hands folded in her lap and her hair loose down one shoulder, and she did not turn her face away from him. "Madam," he said, "Mr. Holloway." "I do not believe I have had the pleasure." "You have not. My name is Clara Whitmore. I teach the children of this town to read. Miss Whitmore, I will say this to you honestly. The arrangement I proposed to Mr. Mercer was a business arrangement. I did not intend you any disrespect by it. In the country I come from, marriages are made for reasons less worthy every day of the week." "I do not doubt it, Mr. Holloway. But this is not the country you come from." He looked at her a long moment longer. Then he put his hat back on his head. "Good day, Mr. Mercer." "Good day, sir." He went out. The buggy turned in the yard. They heard the harness creak and the runners cut into the snow, and they heard him go down the lane. And then they heard nothing but the small, steady sounds of the stove, and Bess at the dry sink, and Silas, leaning against the wall by the door, breathing out very slowly through his nose. "Well," Silas said. "Well," Ethan said. "That's that then." "That's that." Clara stood up from the bench. She came across the room. She did not say anything. She sat down in the chair where Travers had held Ethan's good ankle the night before, and she put her hand on the back of Ethan's wrist where it lay on the blanket. Her hand was warm now. She had thawed. "I'm going to send Mr. Boone to town in an hour," she said. "He will bring the doctor for your leg. He will bring my trunk from the rooms over the dry goods store. And he will tell Mrs. Pickett and Mrs. Henson and anyone else he happens to encounter that I have taken a position at the Bar M as your housekeeper and bookkeeper for the duration of your recovery, and that I will be sleeping in the small room off the kitchen of the main house, which I will lock from the inside every night, and that I expect to be paid a salary that is no business of theirs. Do you have any objection to that, Mr. Mercer?" "None." "Good. Then that is what we will do." Word reached town by noon. It traveled the way these things travel, faster than any horse could carry it, and by supper time that night every parlor in Red Hollow had a version of it. The versions did not all agree. Some had Ethan dead in the snow and Clara dragging him out by his coat. Some had the Stallion gone over the south rail and lost in the storm. Some had Augustus Holloway riding back to Cheyenne with the check uncashed in his pocket, swearing he had never seen a Wyoming rancher quite like that one. That last version was more or less true. Ruth Pickett heard it at her own supper table from her husband, who had heard it at the smithy from Pete Hardesty, who had finally heard a true thing because Silas himself had told him at the livery while they were unloading Clara's trunk. Ruth Pickett set down her fork. She did not finish her meal. She sat for a long time after her husband had gone out to feed the stove in the parlor, and her face moved through several things, and at the end of the moving she got up and put on her shawl and went next door to Mrs. Henson's house in the dark. Mrs. Henson opened her door with her hands in flour up to the wrists. "Ruth, may I come in?" She came in. The two women sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, the same way the women of Red Hollow had sat at one another's tables for 20 years, and Ruth Pickett said, "I owe that woman an apology, Margaret. I have owed her one a long time. I owe her one for what I said in Doolin's on Wednesday, and I owe her one for a great deal before that." Mrs. Henson looked into the lamp. "Yes," she said. "I expect a number of us do." It did not happen all at once. Apologies in a town like Red Hollow did not happen all at once. They happened in small, awkward pieces over the rest of that winter and into the spring, one woman at a time crossing the schoolhouse yard to speak to Clara at the end of the day. One man at a time tipping his hat at her on the boardwalk in a way that meant something, one Sunday at a time on which she sat in a pew nearer the front than she had ever sat before. And nobody remarked on it, because to remark on it would have been to admit what they had been doing all the years before. The town did not say it was sorry. The town never did. But the town changed the way it spoke to her, and to anyone listening that was the same thing. Hap Pruitt did not change. Hap Pruitt got drunk in the saloon on a Tuesday in February and made a remark about the schoolmarm at the Bar M, and Pete Hardesty, who had not previously been a man known for opinions, set his cup down and told Hap that if he heard the name Whitmore come out of Hap's mouth in that tone of voice one more time, he would put Hap through the saloon window himself. And Hap did not say her name in that tone of voice again. He said other things, quieter, to other men who would still listen. But the room got smaller every month, and by spring he was mostly drinking alone. And a man drinking alone in a town like Red Hollow eventually drinks himself out of the conversation altogether. The doctor came out from town on the afternoon of the day Holloway left, and he looked at Clara's splint, and looked at Ethan's leg, and looked at Clara again, and he said, "I could not have done it better myself, Miss Whitmore, and I have done a number of them." And Clara said only that she was glad to hear it, and she went back to the stove. The leg healed slow. It healed crooked, a little, in the way leg bones healed when they were set in a kitchen in a blizzard, and Ethan walked with a small hitch in his step the rest of his life. He did not mind it. He used to say, in the years afterward, that a man with a limp tended to be listened to more carefully, because people assumed he had earned it, and that this was useful in business and in marriage both. The ranch did not go under that spring. It came close. Holloway's cattle went to the Lazy K as he had promised, and the $800 did not arrive, and the note Cyrus Mercer had left on the place came due in March. Ethan rode into Cheyenne on a borrowed buggy with his legs still in a brace, and he sat across a desk from a banker he had never met before, and laid out his books with Clara's bookkeeping on every page of them. And the banker, A man named Witherspoon, who was younger than Ethan had expected and not from any syndicate at all, looked at the pages a long time and said, "Mr. Mercer, you have a creditor's nightmare for a balance sheet and the cleanest set of records I have seen in 2 years. Who keeps your books?" And Ethan said, "My wife." It was the first time he had used the word out loud about Clara, and it was not strictly true at that moment, and he did not correct himself, and Witherspoon did not ask. They were married in April, on a Wednesday morning, at the courthouse in Red Hollow. There were 5 people in the room. Silas stood for Ethan. Bess stood for Clara. The judge was a man named McAfee, who had taught Clara's youngest students to recite the Constitution 2 winters before, and he read the words plain, and he did not embellish them. Clara wore the dark green she had worn one Christmas in 1882. Ethan wore the suit his father had been buried in, which Bess had let out at the shoulders and taken in at the waist. There was no music. There was no party. They walked out of the courthouse onto the boardwalk after, and a small girl named Lou Henson, who was 9 now and had been waiting on the boardwalk for an hour with a fistful of crocus from her mother's yard, came up and put the crocus into Clara's hand and said, "These are for the bravest person in town," and walked away very fast because she was about to cry and did not want to be seen doing it. Clara held the crocus all the way back to the buckboard. That night, alone in the kitchen of the main house at the Bar M, with the windows open to the spring and the frogs starting up down by the river, she set the crocus in a jar of water on the table and looked at them for a long time. Ethan watched her from the doorway. He did not come in. He understood that the moment belonged to her and not to him, and he had learned in 3 months of evenings in that kitchen when to stand at a door and when to come through it. The stallion was ridden, finally, on the first warm Sunday in May. Ethan rode him. Clara stood at the rail and did not say anything. The horse carried him 3 times around the corral at a walk, and twice at a trot, and once at a slow, easy canter, and when Ethan swung down, he put his hand on the horse's shoulder and stood there a long moment with his forehead against the warm hide. The horse did not flinch. The horse did not even particularly notice. The horse was eating an apple Clara had given him from her pocket, and the day was bright, and the apple was the thing the horse cared about. They named him no name. Clara would not have it. She said a horse who had been frightened that long should not have to learn a new word at his age. And they called him only the Black, or sometimes the Boy, and he answered to both and to neither, and lived another 14 years on the Bar M, and threw 28 foals and never once let a stranger touch him, and never once threw a child who climbed his rail. They had 2 of those children, in time. A boy first, in the spring of '89, who they named Cyrus after Ethan's father, and who grew up tall and quiet, and was kicked twice by horses before he was 10, and not seriously either time. Then a girl, in the autumn of '91, who they named Margaret after a woman in Ohio whose name Clara had never spoken out loud in Red Hollow, and finally did, and the girl was loud where the boy was quiet and rode anything with 4 legs from the time she could climb a stirrup. The 2 of them ran through the ranch yard in the long Wyoming evenings of those years, and the black horse watched them go past his fence, as though he had agreed to a long obligation he did not entirely understand but did not intend to break. And Ethan, when his leg was bothering him, would sit on the porch of the main house with his bad leg propped on the rail and watch them all, children and horse, and his wife coming up from the kitchen garden with her apron full of beans. And he would think sometimes about the cook shack table on the night his leg was set, and about a town full of people who had decided what a woman was worth without bothering to ask her, and about how close he had come, that whole hard winter, to being one of them. He did not become one of them. He did not let himself become one. When Mrs. Pickett came out to the Bar M one Sunday in the summer of '89 with a basket of bread and an unspoken apology that she had been carrying for 2 years, he met her at the door and he asked her in for coffee, but he did not let her speak to Clara until he had stood in the parlor and told her, plainly and not unkindly, that Clara was his wife and the mother of his son and the bookkeeper of his ranch, and the woman who had set his leg in a blizzard, and that anything Mrs. Pickett might wish to say to her now had better take all of those things into account. Mrs. Pickett took the rebuke. She took it well. She had her coffee with Clara at the kitchen table afterward, and what passed between the 2 women in that hour was their business, and Ethan, walking the south pasture that morning with his foreman, did not ask about it when he came in. He had learned by then what Silas had told him at the cook shack table in January, that the way to step between a person and the harm done to her was a thing you did not need to be clever about. You only needed to step. You did not need to make speeches. You did not need to choose the right words. You stepped, and the stepping was the speech. And the people who needed to hear it heard it, and the people who did not could go on not hearing it for as long as they liked, but they could not go on pretending you had not stepped. That was the lesson he carried out of that winter. It was not a lesson he had been raised to. It was a lesson Clara Whitmore taught him, partly, and that a black horse taught him, partly, and that a man in a beaver felt hat taught him by negative example, and that he came to in pieces over the long thaw of that year. He never preached it. He was not a man for preaching, but he lived it, in the small daily way men live the things they have actually learned, and his son and his daughter grew up under the example of it, without ever being told it was an example, which is the only kind of example that takes. Clara lived to be 71 years old. She taught school at Red Hollow for another 9 years after she married, and then she taught only her own children, and then she taught the children of the families who came out to the Bar M for work or for help or for a cup of tea at the kitchen table. And she never once in the rest of her life referred to the years before her marriage as anything but before, the way other people referred to the war or to a hard winter. She did not pretend they had not happened. She did not let anyone else pretend either. When her daughter, at 16, came home from a dance at the schoolhouse in tears because a boy had said a thing about her hair, Clara sat with the girl at the kitchen table and told her, plain, what the women of Red Hollow had called her mother for 11 years, and what her father had not said, and what her father had said afterward, and what it had cost both of them to be the people they had become. The girl listened. The girl never came home from a dance in tears again, not because the world had got any kinder, but because she had learned at 16 what it had taken her mother 38 years to learn, that the worth of a person was not a thing other people got to vote on. In the long Wyoming evenings of the years that followed, when the sun went down red behind the bighorns and the corral by the barn caught the last of the light, Clara would sometimes walk out to the rail and put her hand on the bridle of the old black horse, and the horse would lower his head to her, and she would stand there in the cool until the first stars came out. Ethan watched her from the porch on those evenings. He did not call to her. He did not interrupt. He had learned, finally, the things she had been trying to teach him the morning he stood at her door with his hat in his hands, that the way you spoke to a person in private and in public was the whole of what you owed them, and that you could not buy it back with grand gestures afterward, and that the only way to be a man worth standing beside was to be the kind of man who stood beside, when the standing was hard and unrewarded and seen by nobody but the person it was for. That, in the end, was what saved his ranch and his name and his marriage, and what made a town full of people who had once laughed at his wife eventually carry her coffin one rainy morning in the autumn of 1920 from the courthouse in Red Hollow to the small fenced plot above the river where Ethan was already buried, and where the old black horse, 20 years gone by then, had been put down at his own old age and laid in unmarked ground at the corner of the fence. The town came out for her. The whole town. The grandchildren of the women who had pitied her walked behind the coffin, and the great-grandchildren of Hap Pruitt, Hap himself long since drunk to death in a back room of the saloon, walked behind it, and a small girl who was the great-niece of Lou Henson, and who had been told a story by her grandmother once about a fistful of crocus, carried a fistful of crocus in her hand at the front of the procession because it was April and the crocus were up. They buried her beside her husband. They put no inscription on her stone but her name and her dates, because she had asked, in the last winter of her life, for nothing else. Her name and her dates were what she had earned. The town that buried her had been forced, slowly and over the course of half a lifetime, to admit that the earning had been there all along, and that the slowness with which they had seen it was their failure and not hers. That, too, is a kind of justice. It is the kind that arrives late, and that cannot be made up for, and that nonetheless arrives. And that is the only kind history ever offers to people like Clara Whitmore, who do not change the world with speeches, but who change one man and one horse and one small hard town, and through those, in the long quiet way, everything that comes after.